This is a video about a ferry trip I took to Alaska in the summer of 2024. A lot of people think of traveling to Alaska on a cruise ship with the zip lines and the water slides and the go-karts and the midnight buffet, but this is the state-run ferry, what they call the Alaska Marine Highway, a little more bare bones than a cruise ship. Although the route that the ferry takes is similar to what a lot of cruise ships do. Here it is using a map from the Rome to Rio website, because I don't think the ferry website has a good detailed map. It starts down in Washington State at the bottom here, up through what they call the Inside Passage, all the way to Skagway, which is at the north end of the Alaska Panhandle, just south of the 60th parallel. If I zoom in a bit, you can see that the ferry leaves from Bellingham, north of Seattle. It's where that one in a circle is near the bottom, just south of the Canadian border. You sail north between the mainland and Vancouver Island, which is the large island off the coast that does not have the city of Vancouver in it. Just at the top of this map, you can see Prince Rupert in British Columbia, which the ferry used to stop at, but has not since 2019. Note that if anybody has a great desire to travel to Prince Rupert, you can take a BC ferry from Port Hardy on the northern end of Vancouver Island, and you can also drive there from the south. The nice thing about the Inside Passage route is that you're mostly in protected waters, not in the open ocean. When you're between the mainland and Vancouver Island, the island's in the way. Then going north, there's a little section for a few hours where there's no island to the west, known as Queen Charlotte Sound, which got just a little rough. We are close to shore. Also note that I am pretty prone to seasickness. I don't think most of the other people even noticed, but I did stay outside during that time to get the breeze on my face. Once you get past that part, you dive into the Inside Passage north of there, so the water calms down. Then if we move north, showing from Prince Rupert up, that part in the bottom middle there is the very north end of Vancouver Island. There's that little section as you cross the Canada-US border, which is the thick line on shore, which again, there's no island to the west, although that part happened in the middle of the night and I didn't notice it. Then the rest of the way up is protected waters. The first stop is Ketchikan, right there in the middle of the map, at the southern tip of Alaska. You next stop in Wrangell and Petersburg, and then continue north. On this next map, you can see Petersburg at the bottom. You stop in Juneau towards the middle, where that little red dot is, then north to Haines, and then you wind up in Skagway, which is under the 2 in a circle on the map. North of Skagway is the border with British Columbia, the dark jagged line, and then above that, the dotted line right near the top is the border between British Columbia and Yukon. Something to mention here is that you have to go through Canada to drive anywhere from Skagway, which I'll discuss later. So the only way to get to Skagway and stay in the US is to take the ferry. And except for Haines and Skagway, you can't drive to any of these towns, even the ones that are on the mainland, because they have no roads leading inland. The first step in taking the ferry is to get to Bellingham. To reach Bellingham from Seattle, you drive up Interstate 5. It's very easy, as you can see, it's about an hour and a half with no traffic. The only warning I'd give is that you typically are driving up on a Friday, because the ferry departs every week at 6 o'clock on Friday. And traffic is often a little bad on Friday afternoons, going north, because everyone in Seattle is getting away for the weekend, in the summer anyway, to some vacation destination north of there. So allocate a little extra time if you are driving up there. It took me probably 2 hours to get there from Seattle. You need to arrive by 3 o'clock to check in for the ferry. They want you there very early. Zooming in on Bellingham, you get off the highway, go west of the harbor. You can see Bellingham, Ketchikan Ferry, and the water on the map. I gather some people arrive in the late morning, leave their car in the ferry waiting line, and then walk to get something to eat. The terminal is very close to the old part of Bellingham, shown as Fairhaven on the map, which has a lot of restaurants and coffee shops and cool-looking brick buildings and is maybe half a mile away. As you're approaching, you'll see signs saying you're on the way to the ferry and also the Amtrak and the Greyhound stop, which is actually at the train station. The train station is right next to the ferry. There it is. You could theoretically take the train if you're walking on the ferry, meaning you don't have a car. But right now, the schedule of trains going north from Seattle, there's one that gets to Bellingham mid-morning and one that gets to Bellingham in the evening, so neither is ideal for the ferry. If you really like riding the bus, there is a Greyhound from Seattle that gets in at 1:20 in the afternoon. And Amtrak actually has a bus, because Amtrak sometimes operates buses, that gets in at 5:15 p.m. Here you can see the ferry terminal building on the left and the ferry itself, that white boat-like object, on the right. When you arrive, you park in front of the terminal building and go check in. They give you a paper that you tape to the inside windshield of your car, showing your destination, Skagway in this case, and you also get a personal boarding pass. You don't drive directly from the ferry building to the ferry. You have to go loop around as shown, crossing train tracks twice, but it's all well marked. That's the ferry terminal on the left and the queuing area just below the white building. You get assigned a lane and a boarding area based on your destination, and also I think on the size of your vehicle. Skagway is the very last stop, so they put all those cars in the front of the ferry, which is the furthest from the car loading doors, because they're going to get off last. And then as other cars come on, they arrange them so they're not in the way of anybody else, although occasionally they do have to have a few cars get off at an intermediate destination and then get back on to get out of the way. You can go on as a foot passenger as well, and then you can just walk right from the ferry terminal to the ferry. No loop around drive required. The Ketchikan is the ferry I took. It's not the current ferry that's running on the route right now in 2025. I'll get into that a little more detail later, but it's fairly similar in size. This shows the car entrance at the back of the ferry, which is only used in Bellingham on this route. In all the other ports, you use a side entrance. You can see there's a door on either side, and if you look above that, you can see that the passageways on the outside, where the railings are actually split. They can lift up, and theoretically you could load in a very tall vehicle. The people on the ferry said they didn't use it for that. They only used it when they stopped at places that didn't have a real dock, which I didn't quite understand. But anyway, as you can see, this is a view when you're on the ferry. You can see that's the split in the railing and deck. So it can open up in the middle there, and to the right is this very tall garage door that can roll up, theoretically, to accommodate very tall vehicles. So here I am driving my car into the ferry from the back entrance, which, as I said, is only used in Bellingham on this route. Very excited to get started on a trip that I had been anticipating for a while. The car deck on the ferry is basically a giant U shape. That area in the back with the light coming in is where you enter, and we're looking down one part of the U. From back here, you can see the whole U shape of the car deck. This is my car jammed into the back corner of the ferry because I was getting off in Skagway, the last stop, so they stuck it in the very back corner. In fact, when I drove on, they noticed I was traveling by myself, and they made me squeeze my car right against the wall to the right, so I couldn't even open my passenger door to make a little bit more room, just in case. I was one of the first cars on. I think they loaded the small cars bound for Skagway Lane first. Other cars drive in, they fill the giant U based on where you're getting off. For those heading to the first stop, which is Ketchikan, people are going to be directed to be near the car deck entrance exit. Sometimes they make them drive all the way around the U, so they're near the front on the left side, and sometimes they load them later and make them back and on the right side. It all depends on the specific makeup of that ferry's car traffic. There's also a giant turntable embedded in the car deck. This picture is not from the loading in Bellingham. You'll notice it's dark outside. I took this photo at another port. But there's a giant turntable right where you come in. In the middle of the photo is the back entrance, which isn't used at this port, only in Bellingham. Here they're using the side entrance, as you can see. The turntable is in case a large vehicle comes in and can't quite make the turn, which is cool if you like turntables on car ferries. And they can load up to 40-foot motorhomes. A lot of people going to Alaska are RVing, and they're used to accommodating them. I would come down and watch them loading and unloading sometimes because I enjoyed it. Although I never saw them use a turntable. Every vehicle could drive itself in and get placed in the right spot, but it is there. Once you park in your assigned spot on the car deck, you can get out of your car. As I said, they want you in the car waiting area by 3 o'clock. I drove onto the ferry about 3:30. That's when the first Skagway people got on. So there's plenty of time before the ferry sets sail at 6 p.m. The first stop on a ship will be the purser. I recommend getting out and going to the purser as soon as you can. I guess historically on a boat, the purser was the person who held the purse, took payment or something like that. Anyway, think of it as the equivalent of the front desk at a hotel. Follow the signs to the purser, which as you can see is the opposite direction from the boat, except you are on the boat. Boat in this context apparently refers to the car deck. The purser is the other direction up a couple flights of stairs. So here's the lovely purser area. The check-in desk is on the left. Ignore that guy sleeping on the couch. He's cool. You give your name to check-in just like a hotel. You can rent towels if needed. In my case, my room did not come with towels, although most rooms do come with towels. I think it was $3 for towels, but you could also bring your own. These signs are right next to the purser desk. They want to know about any medical personnel on board. There's the cafe hours and the price list for some tchotchkes you can buy on board. Also note the little sign on the counter. It says MV Ketchikan is on Alaska time. The entire trip is run on Alaska time, which is 1 hour earlier than Seattle time. So when you get on the boat at 4 o'clock in Bellingham, it's actually 3 o'clock on the ship. The posted departure time of 6 p.m. is Bellingham time. The time difference really only matters for the question of when will dinner be served. On the first day, it's 6 p.m. Alaska time, which is 7 p.m. Bellingham time. but every port you stop at after Bellingham is in actual Alaska, so the time syncs up. I got my little room key there. This is the hallway outside my room. I think this picture is right side up. Yes, an exciting view of a hallway on a boat. I know I'm probably supposed to call it a ship, but I'll probably call it a boat, or worse, during this video. As it happens, if you continue down that hallway, you would get to the crew sleeping area, where passengers are not allowed to get into. This is my cabin. I actually originally booked a larger cabin. I was supposed to be on a different ferry, the Columbia. There's 2 ships that are used on this route right now, the Ketchikan and the Columbia. The Columbia was being worked on over the winter and was supposed to come out of dry dock in the spring of 2024, before my trip. But a few months before, they emailed me and said the Columbia won't be ready, so you'll be on the Ketchikan. And we're handing out rooms based on the order of reservations, and you are getting this smaller room, which I guess is better than getting no room. It's a little small, but I think having a room is worth it. I'll get into pricing towards the end, but you don't have to book a room. You can camp on the deck or just sleep in a lounge chair in certain designated areas. Note you cannot sleep in your car. But really, my room wasn't very expensive compared to the cost of the whole trip, so I would recommend a room just for a little privacy and a place to lock and store your bags. But it is a pretty small room. It's meant to sleep 2 people, although I was just by myself. If you've ever been on a roomette on an Amtrak train, it's a very similar layout. The Amtrak roomettes also have seats that face each other on the bottom. They're turned into a lower bed, and then a fold-down upper bed. This is bigger than a roomette on Amtrak, but not by a whole lot. And I'll add the same caveat I would for Amtrak, which is that if you're going to actually share this with someone, you should be pretty good friends with them. To turn this into a bed, you have to lower that table that's attached to the wall. It's clipped to the wall and has foldable legs. You can see the clips on the wall. There are high and low positions. You fold the legs and clip it back on in a low position with the edges of the table being supported on the edges of the seats. And then you take the back cushions and put them down on a table in the middle, and that's your bottom bed. Then the top bed is this flip down jobby where you unclip this and lower it down, which they claim is a 2-person job. I don't think it's really a 2-person job. Certainly, I did it by myself without any major injury. If you need help, I'm sure a crew person would help you. But note that as far as I could tell, unlike on Amtrak, they don't come around to every cabin and offer to set the bed up for sleeping. Now the top bed is lowered and there's a little flip-up railing you can use for what it's worth. No cool webbing like on Amtrak. I guess they figure the boat doesn't rock and roll like an Amtrak train, which I agree with. And that's my room. I actually slept on the lower bed. It just seemed easier than climbing up to the upper bed. But during the day, I took a couple of naps, and because I had all my stuff laid out on the bottom, and it was set up in the 2 seats and a table format, it was easier to lower the top bed and take a nap up there. There are outlets in the room. They're on the side of the light. There's also a thermostat, which I have no idea if it did anything or not, but there it is. And there's my little view out the porthole. The porthole didn't have any kind of window covering, but I had a spare pillow, so I made do. There's a place to hang my towels that I rented, and there's the ladder you use to get to the upper bunk if you want to. There's a phone in the room. Apparently you can only dial 999 and star, but for whatever reason they included all 12 buttons. So you get to your room and get set up, but you likely have plenty of time before the ferry leaves. As I said, when you get your car parked, go immediately to check in with the purser and get your key and get to your room and check it out. I was lucky because I was a Skagway passenger. I was among the first to get my car on, so there wasn't a big line at the purser. It also gives you time to load stuff out of your car. When the ship is moving, access to the car deck is prohibited except for a few specific times, so you only have until 6 o'clock to get what you need out of the car before the ship leaves. But you don't have to carry your bags to the purser. You can go back and forth to the car deck while they're loading the other cars on. There's no restriction on that. Just try to avoid getting hit by a car. It's just when the ship is not in port that the car deck access is restricted. So get your car parked, run up to the purser, get your key, go back down, get your bags, bring them up to your room. You can take as many trips as you need. Then you can go and sit at the back of the ferry and watch the cars load. You can see there are these rows of cars waiting in line. If you remember from the overhead map, there's a big white building and they're coming around the corner there, loading in lanes organized by destination and possibly vehicle size. Here's somebody loading on. This is the afternoon's entertainment. There's a whole row of seats on the back of the ship and there's a bunch of passengers sitting there kibitzing about the driving habits of the cars being loaded on. One of the last cars to load was a Tesla. They actually had it park off to the side and made it load at the end, I guess, so they could easily throw it off if it caught fire. I think those last few cars in the waiting area are in some sort of standby mode based on available space, but they did make it on. As I said, there are some people who are foot passengers, no car. They can go on whenever they show up. During a car loading, they stay to the right of that line of orange cones. There were actually a few who got dropped off about 2 minutes before they shut things down. I guess if you know exactly how long it's going to take you to get to the boat, and you know that they let passengers walk on up to the last minute, you might show up very close to the departure time. I know people who live near the Washington State ferries that cross Puget Sound. I don't know exactly how late they can leave their house to get dropped off at the ferry in time to walk on. Another possibility is that these people were just late. Anyway, eventually they shut the gates, and that's it. They start the motors going for about 10 minutes, which creates an impressive humming and vibration throughout the ship. And then off we go, sailing away from Bellingham. You actually get a nice view of Mount Baker. If it's a clear day, Mount Baker is in northern Washington, just basically due east of Bellingham. So you get a little view of it over the hill, leaving Bellingham. Now, you don't need to book a cabin. You can sleep in lounge chairs. That is an option. The number of beds in the cabins obviously is fixed, and so is the space in the car deck. They make you specify the exact size of your car, so they know what can fit in each sailing. But I don't think they limit the number of passengers they allow on with no cabin and no car. Some of the lounge chair spots are indoors and some outdoors. My trip was in the middle of summer. I don't think it got particularly cold at night. The ferry does run all year, by the way. I didn't notice a particular mad rush to claim lounge chairs on that trip. I think there were open lounge chairs left. People do hop on and claim a lounge chair right away by draping a sleeping bag over it, and that seems to be respected for the duration of the trip. As a foot passenger, you would be carrying everything on your back, so maybe those people want the lounge chairs. You're also allowed to pitch a tent on the deck. I guess those could be foot passengers in backpacking mode where they have everything including their tent and their backpack. Or maybe people with cars where it's more like car camping. You keep most of your stuff in your car. You don't have to really pack super efficiently because you can just have your whatever in the car and carry it up in multiple trips. There was a couple who parked next to me on the car deck when we boarded who were planning to camp on deck. They were sort of excited about it, actually. You just bring your tent and pitch it right there on the deck. I actually have that exact tent, the orange one, the Big Agnes Copper Spur for backpacking. It is a great tent, amazingly compact. There are some areas where you're not allowed to sleep. The forward lounge, sort of the main lounge, is not for sleeping. You can sleep in the aft lounge from 8 to 8. I suppose you could not try to claim a permanent spot for the whole trip and just grab a spot in the aft lounge each night, or just roam around like a zombie all night. There are lockers if you want a safe place to store your stuff. Obviously, one of the issues with camping in a tent or sleeping in a lounge chair is you don't have a room with a key, but you can use the lockers. There's also bathrooms available. As you may have noticed, my room didn't have a bathroom, although a lot of them do, so I was using the shared bathrooms along with the lounge chair and tent people. These are the showers in the bathroom down the hall from my room. There's a handicapped one on the left. This is another shower on another floor. This one has a great innovation, which I will zoom in on, which is a soap dish. The first one didn't have a soap dish. Memo to Alaska Marine Highway System, please. When you're renovating the Kennecott, can you throw a soap dish onto the Deck 8 men's shower? Thank you. The shower itself is fine in terms of water pressure. If you care about modesty, the showers are in a room separate from the main bathroom with a curtain in front of each shower. For the men's showers anyway, there are benches in that room, but you don't get a little private changing area for each shower. I was a bit worried about taking a shower on a moving ship in terms of slipping in the shower, although that turned out not to be a problem. So I cleverly thought I would take a shower when we were docked in Ketchikan. Then later I saw this sign. Not the one about renting towels, we discussed that already, and not the one about disposing of linens sold with bodily fluids that includes a helpful list of bodily fluids. I mean, this really small sign explaining why you aren't supposed to take a shower when you are in port. Oh well. There's also a washing machine, which is free. This is in the men's bathroom, actually in the room with the showers, as you can possibly tell. I assume there's one in the women's bathroom also, but I didn't want to get kicked off the ferry trying to find that out. I didn't need to do laundry. It's a 3-day trip. I had my car there, so I wasn't short on clothing or anything, but it's nice to know you have the option to do laundry. There's sinks and towel dispensers, all the latest modern amenities. Yes, they have annoying sensor-driven towel dispensers. A nice little reminder to wash your hands, too. Because it's a ship, they recommend the nautical-themed song Baby Shark as a way to track how long 20 seconds is, or Happy Birthday for landlubbers. And don't flush anything except toilet paper. Given the vibe of the ship, I assume the plumbing might not be in great shape, so don't flush those flushable wipes in particular. I think it's what they're worried about feminine hygiene products probably also. The supply of toilet paper, as I recall, wasn't actually that bad in terms of, well, you know. Anyway, enough about using the toilets. Let's talk about creating demand for the toilets. The food on the ship. The cafe opens for hanging out at 6 a.m. and breakfast is at 7. Again, this is Alaska time, so that first dinner at 6 o'clock is actually served at 7 o'clock Bellingham time, an hour after you leave. This is the dining area on the Ketchikan, which has a cafeteria, meaning you grab food at the counter, pay for it, and then sit down. The Columbia, the other long-haul ferry, has a dining room where they take your order and bring it to you. I don't actually know what the menu is on the Columbia, but from some internet sleuthing, I don't think the food selection is much different than what the Ketchikan offers in the cafeteria. As you can see, the seating area is a decent size. There's also this extra overflow dining area. Sometimes it was open, sometimes it wasn't. I couldn't really tell what the logic there was, but again, I never had trouble finding a seat. They have a standard menu. This is their breakfast menu. It's all made fresh. There are cooks on board. You can watch the guy cook your eggs on a grill in front of you. Then there's a standard sandwich menu. Again, sandwiches are made fresh. The burgers are grilled fresh, etc. They always have some soups, usually chili and some other stuff, and salads. As you may observe, you have to pay for the food. This is a ferry, not a cruise. They do take credit cards, though. They also have specials at every meal, which are posted when you come in. There's a meat lover's omelet. There's a reasonable variety. They never repeated the special. They managed to find 3 different omelets to serve for 3 days of breakfast. SEP Jack Cheese Biscuits, I forget what that stands for, but they were pretty good. This is the Alaska Ferry, so I guess this sign is necessary. This is the area where you actually get your food. You come in here, and around to the left is the cashier and the actual eating area. They have a bunch of tea. They got a bunch of condiments. They also have some stuff that's kind of prefab. There's some juices. There's bagels and pre-made sandwiches if you don't want to wait in line for whatever it is they're going to make. I did see some people who seemed to be in backpacking mode for their food, where they were eating dehydrated meals and granola bars, but most people seem to be buying food at the cafeteria. There's some desserts as well. There's an espresso machine available 24 hours a day on the port side, which somebody crossed off and wrote starboard, which, yes, that is correct. It's on the starboard side. To be fair, it is to the left as you face this sign, so I can see why it was confusing. Also, it was broken. If you notice the sign stuck on here, in addition to the machine being on the wrong side of the boat, it's out of order. The cafeteria is all certified by the Alaska Food Code. You'll be happy to know. You can sit and get a nice little view out the window. Here are some of my various meals. You might occasionally sit behind a pole, but in this case, you can move. There's also a bar. You can start drinking at noon and go until 11:30 at night with an hour to sober up before dinner. They have a menu of drinks, beer, wine, hard seltzer, cutwater cocktails. The bar is just next to where you get your food. It's nothing special, at least nothing special enough for me to remember to take a picture of it. There are ship directories posted in various spots. There's the cabin deck, which is mostly cabins. The cabin deck is the lowest shown here. It is listed as deck 6, with the car deck being deck 4. That little open area with the curvy wall, that's where the purser is. The rest is cabins. The boat deck is deck 7, basically the dining area and the main lounge, so the social hub of the ship. Deck 8, the sun deck, is some cabins, including mine, and also some outdoor areas, which I guess is where the name comes from. Then deck 9, the solarium deck, is just the solarium, which is, like I said, an area where people can camp, and there's a little indoor viewing seating area as well. This is the forward lounge on the boat deck, the main area for hanging out. This is another lounge. I think it's the lounge on the solarium deck, which faces sideways. I hope so, because if this is looking forward, we're about to slam into the trees there. There's a bunch of tables in the forward lounge, which brings up the question, what do you do on this ship to while away the time? Well, you can read. This is right next to the purser's area. They have some books. They have a book of Robert Service poems, which if you grew up in Canada or are at all familiar with Northern poetry, you'll sort of find amusing. I mean, the existence of the Robert Service book is amusing. The poems themselves, I guess, are also sort of amusing. Then as each port approaches, they lay out information about things to do. This is actually as we're coming back into Bellingham. But one big thing you do is jigsaw puzzles. There's a big jigsaw puzzle culture, you might call it, on the boat. There are a bunch of jigsaw puzzles that have been left by people. There's also, I think, a chess set, a backgammon set. Some people bring their own stuff. One family brought a big Lego model, and they worked on it throughout the various days. But the main action is jigsaw puzzles, just done over and over. And most of them have all their pieces. There's a good mix, 500s, thousands, all pretty doable in a time frame. It seemed they usually cleaned up all the puzzles overnight, so you have to finish in one day. Here's a lovely chickens one I worked on. This is Mont Saint-Michel. A little tricky with the sky and water, but we got her done. You often wind up collaborating on puzzles with people because they'll be working on a puzzle. You sit down and say, can I work on it with you? People are usually amenable to that, and there's not a ton of tables, so you kind of have to share them. This is this weird fish sticks puzzle, which the pieces are all these weird, long, straight things. I would recommend against trying the fish sticks puzzle. I eventually gave up. Me and another woman worked on it. We abandoned it right around this point because it was just too much of a pain to do. I did see someone making better progress on it on a different day, however. Other things to see, there's a display of various citations the Ketchikan has received. Most of them actually spelled the name of the ship correctly. Actually, those three are for the same thing, the Voluntary Ship Observing Program from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from 2002 through 2004. Don't know what happened after that. This is a program where ships report the weather at their exact location since they tend to be the only people at that spot. There's a website about it if you want to learn more. There's some artwork, sort of northerly Alaska-y artwork. I know I'm running low on excitement here, but this is the emergency instructions in the elevator. There is an elevator that goes from the car deck all the way up to the solarium. It actually is a hand-cranked phone if you get stuck in the elevator, I guess. Here's some more artwork, northern artwork. The ship model is the one that James Cook went to Australia with, the Endeavour, which I know because some kid asked me how to pronounce it. Here's a picture of the Ketchikan being built in 1998. It's actually much newer than the Columbia, which is from the 70s. It was built in Mississippi, made its way through the Panama Canal to get over to the Alaska side. There's also a kids' play area. You have to provide your own kids. There's a theater. I'm not sure this was actually a going thing when I was on a ship. I never saw them actually showing anything. And hey, we got cornhole, so don't say there's no fun. This is the sun part of the sun deck. Deck 8, which is where my cabin was. In fact, I'm pretty sure one of those portholes was my cabin. And of course, there's an axe. If the boat starts to sink, you can chop a hole in the side to let the water out, both inside and outside axes. Obviously, fire safety is a concern, so the ship is suitably equipped for all that. There's life preservers and lifeboats. I assume they have enough. It's not a Titanic situation. Here I am walking next to the lifeboats. The only thing I recall about this picture is that I got a massive weed smell as I walked right by here coming from, I don't know, inside the lifeboat or the solarium or who knows. It is prohibited on a ship, I will point out. But the other thing you can do on the ship is look at views. It's super scenic. The ship covers a lot of the same route as the cruise ships, which also go up the inside passage. And also you stop at towns like Wrangell and Petersburg, which the big cruise ships don't stop at. Some of the channels are pretty narrow, especially the ones to get to the smaller towns, and you feel like you're doing a bit of a speed run through them. You can see there's a buoy there. You're weaving down this channel. It's sort of exciting if you like imminent maritime disasters. You're very close to shore on both sides. Don't worry, I'm sure they know what they're doing. But you can see there's a bunch of excited people out there watching this, even in the cold weather. Here we are again. There's a couple boats in front of us here, but you also just get beautiful scenery. Here we are again going down narrow passageways. So really just staring out the window when you get tired of doing jigsaw puzzles or cribbage. I don't play cribbage, but a lot of cribbage was going on. So yeah, this is typical scenery. This is a lot of the same scenery you get on a cruise ship to Alaska. Also, the big cruise ships do a lot of the movement at night, so they can be in port for a long time during the day, while the ferry just moves whenever, so there's more daytime scenery. So, scenery, scenery, scenery. This is some, I don't know, probably fish processing plant somewhere. Still looks nice, don't know what it smells like. Okay, I looked it up, and it really is a fish processing plant in the British Columbia town of Bella, and there's the ferry dock to the left of it. We don't stop there, that's the BC ferries. You do pass, if you remember the map, there's towns along the way that are on the water. You pass these little random settlements that have some kind of civilization in it. But yes, it's very scenic. And the weather was actually pretty good for our trip. Mostly sunny, as you can see. A little bit cloudy. There was one slightly chilly day, but really very pleasant. Scenery, scenery, scenery. Occasionally you see other boats cruising by. Docking in port is kind of interesting, or relatively interesting compared to the rest of the trip, because you get to watch them pull in and dock this puppy. All these ports have these bumpers to keep the ferry from taking out the dock. You can see there's the boat ramp, that blue thing. In this photo, I think we're actually leaving based on the wake, but as you come into a port, they're trying to get the boat ramp lined up at the right spot in the ferry. There's people out there at each port will come out and tie us up. Here we are docked in Wrangell. The ramp is on the right at the back of the boat. You can watch cars and people get on and off. This truck got off at every port. I believe it was delivering mail. It had a little happy face on the top. It got off at every port first and then got on last just before we left. This was a highly entertaining moment in Haines, which is the stop just before Skagway. This guy was trying to back his giant fifth wheel, an RV trailer, onto the boat. You can't see it here, but he's in a pickup truck in the front. So he's trying to back it onto the ramp, but the water was kind of low at this time, so there's a bit of an angle as you come onto the ramp. The ferry employees were very worried about his trailer scraping on the angle and getting stuck. So they spent a lot of time trying to make this work. This woman here in the red jacket was just obliviously risking death by wandering by during this. But they got these boards out that they set up, and they were like, well, if we raise the wheels a bit, somehow we'll get over the hump. The guy's wife had walked on board and was standing next to me, videotaping the whole thing like any sensible person would. And they're working away. They got the thing backed up a bit, but now they're like, well, we still have to put more boards. This really was quite the operation here. Eventually what they had to do, which was some outside-the-box thinking, was they untied the ferry from the dock. Normally when the ship is docked, that part visible at the bottom of the ramp slaps down onto the edge of the car deck. What they did is undock the ferry, moved it a bit away, then raised the ramp up somewhat to reduce the angle, had the guy back onto the ramp, and then stop with the pickup and trailer entirely on the ramp, and then they brought the boat back in and tied up again, lowered the ramp down, and he drove onto the ferry. I guess they have to deal with this problem, so they know what to do, but it was quite an extensive operation to get this one camper on, and they spent a lot of time trying the raise it with boards method before they went to the undock the ferry and bring him onto the ramp method. In fact, his wife said they were only going from Haines to Skagway, which is a very short distance. It's only 45 minutes on the ferry, but there's no direct road. It's about a 6-hour trip around to get there, including crossing the Canada-US border twice. Anyway, so eventually this guy's on the ramp. Now we're watching with bated breath. The next phase is, can this guy back his giant camper with a pickup down the ramp without smacking it into the side of the ramp? Actually, his wife said he owns a trucking company or something similar and does this all the time, and she wasn't particularly worried about this part. You can see he's taking it very casually. He's got one arm out the window and then one arm on the wheel, and he did, in fact, pull it off very smoothly. He's turning here because they're telling him to turn to start to angle into the ship properly, not because he messed up the backing up. There actually was a smattering of applause from the assembled gawkers when he made it on. Certainly a highlight of the trip. The next topic of import is car deck calls. As I said, you can't be on a deck when a ship is moving. That's the rule, I guess, for safety, because the cars could shift unexpectedly. So you usually can't get to your car when a ship is moving. And as I said, you can't sleep in your car. But they do let you have these deck calls 4 times a day. The only time this really is a huge issue, the only time you're on the water for a long time, is the first segment between Bellingham and Ketchikan, the southernmost Alaska port, which is about 36 hours. So 4 times a day there's a car deck call. That allows you to go to your car and get stuff or return stuff. But the most important thing is it lets you attend to your pets, because pets are allowed on the ferry, but they can't leave the car deck. No people sleeping in their cars and no pets sleeping in the rooms or in tents. So the main purpose of the car deck calls, as you might guess from the please clean up after your pets note, is bio break for your pets. So people run down when the car deck call happens and let their pets do their thing. Now you might ask, where do the pets do their thing? You can see they've carefully segmented it. The orange area in the back section of the car deck, where the turntable is for quote-unquote walking your dog. Walking, of course, mostly being a euphemism for pooping, for the dogs, I mean. And there are paper towels in a yellow area along the wall there. There they are. Oops, almost out. Well, I'm sure there's more. This is all explained in this handout they give you, so you can blame the Coast Guard for all this. Note that the car deck calls can get canceled if the weather is bad. As I mentioned, you're rarely in the open ocean where the water would get rough, but I did just hear about a Columbia sailing this winter where they had a lot of rough weather. They had to cancel some of the car deck calls coming up to Ketchikan, and even got delayed a couple of hours just trying to dock in Ketchikan. Pay attention here at the bottom where it says thoroughly clean up after your pet. Don't just smear it around. Yeah, really, could you not just smear it around? But it does make you wonder. You're on the car deck. You're like, what's that mysterious liquid on the ground? Well, who knows? Tread wisely on the car deck, I guess, especially on the turntable. I'll mention it when you're in port. You can walk off the ferry as you please. They just want you back 15 minutes before departure time, which, of course, in our very first stop, 2 people almost missed the ferry entirely. They had already closed the gate and they had to kind of run up and get led on. But anyway, in some of the towns, Wrangell and Ketchikan, you're pretty much right there in town. You can walk in, go to a store, get something to eat if you have time. Other places like Juneau and Sitka, you're outside of town, although there will be taxis waiting to take you into town and bring you back in time to get back on the ferry. But you can walk your pet off, certainly, and have them relieve themselves in a nice patch of grass somewhere. Otherwise, it's just right there on the car deck. And no, I don't know why this sign is capitalized like that at the bottom. So eventually we got to Skagway. There are these video displays of maps at various places. You can see where the ship is and also what route you've taken. You'll sometimes see big cruise ships, especially in port. Skagway is a giant cruise ship destination. This is going up the channel of Skagway, just north of Haines. You can see these cruise ships kind of lurking there around the corner. This is 2 of them in Skagway that were there that day, and this is a third, the Ovation of the Seas. You pull in between them, actually. This is the dock in Skagway. Our boat did a beautiful 180 turn right in front of all the cruise ships, showing off, no doubt, and then backed into the dock, although we still exited through the side door. So you get up to Skagway, and here we are getting off, and now we're free, back on terra firma. This is a picture from a viewpoint overlooking Skagway. That little tiny crate in the middle there, between the cruise ships, is the ferry. When a cruise ship passes you, it doesn't feel like it's so much more massively giant, but the ferry is about 400 feet long, and the cruise ships are about 1,000 feet long. They're basically twice as long, twice as wide, and twice as tall as the ferry. When you're on the ferry, it doesn't feel particularly small. This is my final picture from Skagway from the same viewpoint the next day. Of course, the ferry's gone, sailing south, but there are 3 new cruise ships that have arrived in Skagway overnight. The Woozles have been replaced with other Woozles. It's like that all summer. There's a little display up near the port in Skagway. It shows the plan for the summer. Pretty much every day for the entire summer sailing season, there are going to be 2 or 3 cruise ships in Skagway, and then they'll disappear, and there'll be new ones the next day. After the ferry ride, I drove north from Skagway to Whitehorse. I won't get into details of that, but just point out that to go from Skagway, the only road out is through British Columbia. So that little border there, the dark part, is the border into British Columbia, into Canada. And then when you get near the place called Pennington, which I don't think is actually anything, that little dotted line is crossing into Yukon, still in Canada, but north of the 60th parallel. All this is important because it means if you want to take the ferry and get to Alaska, from the panhandle to the pan of Alaska, you have to go through Canada. This is not a huge issue unless you have a DUI conviction, or you're trying to bring in a gun or a pet or a boat, or you don't have a passport, but be aware of it. The ferry service used to run what are called cross-Gulf sailings, where they sailed from Juneau to near Anchorage, so you could avoid Canada entirely. But those are not happening for at least a couple more years due to lack of ships. The Columbia was being refurbished in 2024 when I sailed on the Kennecott. Now the Columbia is back sailing this route in 2025, while the Kennecott is being refurbished, including replacing the generators and emissions upgrades. Then in 2026, the Kennecott is going to run this trip again, while the Columbia goes back in to have its propulsion systems replaced. So it will be at least a couple of years, 2027, before they actually have 2 full long-distance ferries. Once they have 2, they can have one doing the round trips from Bellingham up to Skagway, and then the other one going cross-Gulf. But for now, you have to drive through Canada. And also, I'll add a minor warning that this road, the highway from Skagway North, the South Klondike Highway, is the only way up, and it occasionally closes. There was a landslide on it later in the summer, or there might be forest fires. So when you're planning your trip, as I advise anybody when driving around the north, expect that there may be unexpected road closures. It's through mountainous and forested terrain, and there's generally no alternate roads, so just leave extra days in your schedule. The highway actually closed on a Tuesday, the day after the ferry arrived, and in fact I spent the night in Skagway on Monday night, so if I had taken my trip 4 weeks later, I might have gotten stuck. When the landslide closed the highway from Skagway, clearly it was a bit of an emergency. They got it open for at least one-way traffic, alternating one-way traffic, a couple days later, which I'm sure was fine given the low traffic level on the road. And they opened it completely a week later. But be prepared with some flex in your schedule. Maybe an extra day in Skagway, an extra day in Whitehorse, or wherever you were heading to account for that possibility. I drove around the north for a couple of weeks, and then I came south and took the ferry back down to Bellingham. I left from Haines just to see some different countryside on the way. Haines is in the same situation as Skagway. You can only drive to it through British Columbia via the Yukon, and there's only one highway. So just be warned, there may be delays. If you want to drive from Haines to Skagway, you have to go north on this highlighted highway, then go east. You can just see Whitehorse is there in the top right corner of this image, and then come south to Skagway, which is very close to Haines on the map, but it's about 6 hours or so by car. So if you can hit the ferry time right, it is faster to take the ferry, even if your trailer almost gets stuck on the ramp. The drive shown here to Haines is very scenic going south from Haines Junction, especially the part in British Columbia, Tachinshini, Alsek Park, which is that whole triangle of BC to the west of the highway, all the way to Alaska and Yukon borders. It's just flat out gorgeous the entire way. There's not a soul in sight. I think I passed 1 or 2 cars, maybe, coming that direction. In the winter, that whole part west of the highway is a giant snowmobile zone. Once you cross the border into Alaska, which it's labeled Mosquito Lake, you start to see houses along the way, all the way down into Haines. I do recommend doing what I did if you want to do this trip. Go through Skagway one way and go through Haines the other way. Here we are in Haines waiting to load onto the ferry, which is coming from Skagway where it docked earlier that day. When I got to Bellingham going north, the ferry was sitting there after having docked earlier in the morning. That's where they do the full replenishment every week. But Skagway is a quick turnaround, and then Haines is just an unload-load stop. I got to the Haines ferry dock 2 hours before boarding as requested, which is long before the ferry arrives, which means I got to see the boat approach. It's funny, when you're on a cruise ship, you never see the ship approaching, right? It's a similar situation to the ferry in Bellingham. It's sitting there in port when you get there to start, and then every place you go, you just dock, and they get off and get back on, and then the ship leaves with you on it, hopefully. If you can see your cruise ship moving when you're on shore, something is very wrong. So seeing the ferry approach over the water was actually kind of cool. I felt a certain fondness for the ship as I saw it approaching and was quite looking forward to the trip down, just as I enjoyed the trip up. And I thought, well, this might be a slightly rusty bucket, but I know it will get me there. And look, these are the actual boards that they used 2 weeks earlier when trying to get that fifth wheel on the ship. If you remember, that was also in Haines. They're stored right there on the side of the ramp. You'll notice that the ramp is essentially flat here. The water is much higher on that day. Nobody's getting stuck this time, which is good because I think there are a lot more people loading at Haines for a southbound trip. Haines is the more direct route to Alaska than Skagway. Skagway is more for people going to the Yukon. So on a northbound sailing, like 2 weeks earlier, when the trailer almost got stuck, there aren't many people loading at Haines, since the only place it goes is Skagway. There's a lot of unloading at Haines when sailing northbound, and a lot of loading at Haines when sailing southbound. So here I am back on the ship and heading south back to Bellingham from Haines, but you can't see Haines on this map because that big 1 in a circle blots out most of it. Here you can see a little closer. Well, again, the 1 is right on top of Haines, but you can see we're not leaving from Skagway. One difference from the trip north is that this sailing is going to stop at Sitka. The way it works is you can't quite do a round trip from Bellingham to Skagway in a week if you stop at Sitka in both directions. Sitka, as you can tell, is a little out of the way near the ocean. So what the ferry does every week is only go to Sitka in one direction or the other, just alternating. 1 week it hits Sitka going north, and then the next week it hits Sitka going south. Every trip leaves Bellingham on Friday at 6 p.m. If it's skipping Sitka like my sailing north did, you get to Skagway on Monday, so 3 nights on the ferry. And if you're going to Sitka northbound, you get to Skagway on a Tuesday, so 4 nights on the ferry. And then the trip south is the same. If you skip Sitka, it's 3 nights. If you hit Sitka, it's 4 nights, like this one will be. So because my trips north and south were 2 weeks apart, it worked out for Sitka-related purposes, as if I had just done a straight round trip. I only got Sitka on the way south. If I'd done them a week apart, I would have either gotten Sitka both ways or gotten Sitka no ways. The way I did it, where you skip Sitka northbound, is a bit more convenient because you hit Haines northbound, Skagway, and Haines southbound all on Monday afternoon. Whereas the itinerary that stops at Sitka northbound gets to Haines northbound Tuesday at 1:45 a.m., Skagway at 4:15 a.m., and Haines southbound at 7:15 a.m., and you're supposed to be in line at Haines 2 hours before that. So we did go to Sitka southbound, which offered a bit more scenery on the way. Even though Sitka's close to the ocean, you don't get exposed to waves, as you can see here. You're going through channels again, some quite tight channels getting out there. When we docked, I could have taken a taxi into town. We had a couple of hours at the dock, and the taxi drivers know the ferry schedule, so they were there to meet it, and they will get you back to the ferry in time. I chose not to do this. Apparently, it's an interesting place because of the Russian influence, so maybe next time. I want to compare the scheduled itinerary to the actual. This is the planned trip, what was on the website before I left, going southbound. So leave Haines at 5:45, get to Juneau in the evening, Sitka at 9:45 the next morning. Towards the end, we were supposed to have 5 hours in Ketchikan during the day, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., which I thought, wow, this is great. And the Ketchikan, the port is right in town. This is cool. I'll have 5 hours to walk around Ketchikan, catch that U.S.-Canadian lumberjack show, watch someone make a rabbit carving with a chainsaw or whatever. But this is our actual trip they handed me when I checked in at Haines. For whatever reason, well, I'm pretty sure the reason is tides, it changed significantly. Notice they still leave Haines at 5:45 p.m. and get to Bellingham at 8 a.m. 4 days later, and they stop at the same places in the same order, but the times have changed. If you compare them, planned on the left and actual on the right, instead of leaving Juneau 2.5 hours after docking, we left Juneau the next morning, and everything got pushed back. And in particular, we were only going to be in Ketchikan for an hour and a half. So be it. It did mean most of the sailing to Sitka was during the day, which was nice. Petersburg and Wrangell, those 45-minute layovers there, that's basically the shortest they'll schedule because they need 45 minutes to get the mail truck off, do whatever they have to do, get the few cars off and on. There's not a lot of people who come to and from Wrangell, but people want to walk, take their dogs for a walk or whatever. So 45 minutes is the minimum, which gives you 30 minutes on shore with the 15 minutes early they want you back. But anyway, the schedule got pushed back, so I didn't have my long time in Ketchikan. Sitka wound up being in the afternoon instead of the morning, but still during the day, which is nice. In Petersburg, it was early morning instead of being very late at night, and Wrangell was no longer in the middle of the night, but I wasn't really planning to do anything in Petersburg and Wrangell since I think I'd crushed them in half an hour on the way up. Loading in Haines was similar to Bellingham, except we loaded from the side, not the back. And of course, there are already some cars from Skagway. They did put us in lanes at Haines based on where we were going so they could order the car to some extent. They tell you when you check in which lane to go in. My car still got stashed sort of in the back, although not quite as far in the corner, because I was getting off in Bellingham, which is the last stop in this direction. There were cars from Skagway to Sitka and Skagway to Ketchikan, etc., but they still had it set up when they loaded in Skagway, so that when we loaded in Haines, there was a way to get cars back into the corner for people going to Bellingham to get them out of the way. I actually heard some of the ferry people talking as they were approaching some port when they knew the layout of where the cars are already on the ferry and who was loading and where they were going. They were trying to sort of plan out dynamically where they were going to stash the cars so people could get on and off as smoothly as possible. There's someone going to Juneau. They've got a little Juneau tag in the corner on the window. They took all the motorcycles and put them on the side of the car deck. That's a Bellingham motorcycle. They tied them down with these straps because, of course, they don't want them going anywhere. More exciting pictures of cars on a ship. Here's a camper going to Sitka, in fact. There's a Coast Guard air station in Sitka, which from random conversations seemed to be the main reason people were going there, which reminds me, I was talking to a woman on the ferry who was there with her adult daughter, and she was discussing dating in Sitka, much to her daughter's amusement, and she said that for a woman, the odds were good, but the goods were odd, which has nothing to do with the ferry, but it's too good a line not to mention. This is my room on the trip back. This is a bigger room. It has 2 bunk beds and has a sink, no toilet, but a sink which is actually quite useful just to be able to brush your teeth in your room and stuff. And it actually came with towels included. Still had the ladder, even had a chair. That door on the side, I guess, on the right, maybe means you can connect to rooms. That's not the door to the hallway. The door is where I'm standing. But this one did not have a window. It was an inside cabin. But there, this artwork on the wall where the window would be had the same phone, still only 2 buttons that matter. If you zoom in, you can see it was made by Hose McCann, model 9325. If you want to get a snappy phone like this, you'll be happy to hear they still make it. The room had a drawer for blankets, although all the blanket drawer had in it was a Bible. I'll leave the symbolism to somebody else. There's also a life jacket under the bed. I assume my roommate on the way up also had a life jacket in it somewhere, although I don't recall it. In Haines, we saw another Alaska State car ferry, the Hubbard, basically waiting for us to leave so it could dock. This is a smaller ferry that mostly does Juneau, Haines, Skagway, and back every day, although some days it sails to other places from Juneau. Here it is moving into the dock after we pulled away. The Hubbard's pretty new. It entered service in 2019. It has a cafeteria and a lounge, but no sleeping facilities. It's just a day boat. If you're wondering where the actual town of Haines is in this picture, the ferry terminal in Haines is 5 miles from town. For whatever reason, I guess because that's where they had room for it. But it's sort of around a corner, around a mountain, which means the cell service is lousy. This is heading south from Haines, very scenic. I think there might be an orca in here somewhere. We did see one while heading south just after leaving Haines. Since we left at 5:45 and dinner starts at 6 p.m., there's a mad rush for food in the cafeteria just after departure. They gave a safety demo, which I'm sure they also did on a trip north, but I missed it. There is information on how to use life jackets posted, along with general emergency information. Later that evening, we reached Juneau, and next to us was the Hubbard. It also has the back door and side door configuration for cars. Juneau has multiple places for ferries to dock, unlike Haines, so they could dock next to us. The ferry terminal is about 12 miles outside of town, past the airport and the Mendenhall Glacier, but we were there for 7 hours until 5:45 a.m., so I suppose if you wanted to go drinking in Juneau, that was an option. Actually, according to my quick research, you were more likely to find a bar open at midnight closer to the ferry terminal and airport. I guess they know their audience. Heading south, I did more jigsaw puzzles. There were many remaining that I had not done on the way up. I tackled this jigsaw/crossword puzzle, which was fun, although it has some of the most ridiculous words in it. A few pieces missing, but it was still fine. And this is a puzzle I bought up north that I solved and then left on a ship for others. Here's somebody else attempting to tackle it. More food menus, bacon breakfast burrito, yum. And then there are more shots of my food choices. Here I splurged and got some pie out of the fridge. This is me just eating pasta salad for dinner, or whatever meal this was, because I didn't want to wait in line for my actual cooked food. Then this is the bacon something pancakes that were good. Here again, I think I just got salad, plus a prefab sandwich, and a bagel, and called that a meal, because I didn't want to wait in line. The wait in line was not usually too bad. I don't think the trip south was particularly more full than the one north. I probably just got unlucky a few times showing up for a meal when it happened to be busy. Here we are in Ketchikan. The airport is actually across the water from the town. You have to take this little ferry to get to the airport. Ketchikan is also where they usually store and service the ferries. Here's the Columbia, the other long-distance ferry, the one I originally booked my trips on. When they moved me to the Kennecott, they said the Columbia was going to still be in dry dock. But technically it was not in dry dock. The dry dock is on the left there. And the Columbia was floating there outside the dry dock, looking freshly scrubbed. In the time since I took my trip, the Columbia has been brought in to run the weekly round trips in Bellingham, and the Kennecott went in for repairs, as I mentioned earlier. This ship is the Matanuska, which is the third big ferry that the Alaska system has. It's just sitting there in Ketchikan, kind of around the corner from the Columbia. I'm not sure what the plans for it are. As far as I know, they are focusing on the Columbia and the Kennecott as the long-distance ferries. If you compare the Matanuska to the other two, it's a little smaller, but clearly able to handle similar itineraries with comparable number of people and cars. This satellite view of Ketchikan shows where everything is. That is the dry dock on the left. Then where the Columbia was when I came by is here. The Matanuska is around the corner, and the dock is to the right. Zooming in a bit, you can see the Matanuska and the dock. This is a line of bumpers to stop the ferry, and the car ramp connects from there to the shore. There's a smaller ferry on the left where the Columbia was when I came through. I think that is a Hubbard-sized ferry. This is the dry dock from the sky. This is actually a more recent picture, which shows the Kennecott in dry dock, so from earlier this year. If you zoom in, you can tell it's the Kennecott because it has that sort of jagged part in the front of the superstructure. Wait, what is that in the back? It's a helicopter landing pad? Seriously? I never knew that was there because I was never high enough to see it. Yes, here it is. Apparently the Kennecott is also an oil spill response ship, so it is the only Alaska ferry with a helicopter landing pad. Anyway, south of Ketchikan, there is this roughly 36-hour trip with no stops before you reach Bellingham. Here we are cruising back south, going down through the Inside Passage somewhere in Canada, as shown on the onboard map displays. Again, quite scenic. We had a very nice sunset the last day. And here we are about to get into Bellingham, where I had been 3 weeks before. I dropped off my key along with everybody else. I did walk around the ship. I was kind of curious what the other cabins looked like. This is basically my room. It's the identical layout, but there's a window, which is nice. Looks like they still managed to hang the artwork in there. And then some of the rooms have a full bath, which is even nicer. Some of them have 4 beds. This one shows all 4 beds ready for use. 2 of the beds are fixed. One flips down and one is the couch pull out. So basically my room going up and my room going down combined together. This is the same room but with a window and the bed's up. You do some magic thing on the couch and it turns into a bed. This one is a handicap room. It has a nicer shower and more room. In terms of handicapped access, the ship is pretty good. There's the elevator that goes to all the floors. There's a few places where the floor is a bit of a ramp. For example, between the cafeteria and the forward lounge, there's a bit of an uphill for whatever reason. But I don't think it's an obstacle to a wheelchair. I did use the elevator a couple of times, for example, to take that important picture of the hand-cranked phone, and there was never much of a wait for the elevator. There is this one spot, getting from the car deck to the elevator, which is just to the right, where you have to cross that little hump. It looks a little tough to me, but there were a couple of people in a wheelchair on my trip, and any time I saw them go over this hump, there was always somebody there offering to help. And I'm sure you could grab a ferry person if you needed to. All the ferry employees were extremely helpful. So here I am back in Bellingham, going off the back of the ship and back to my normal life. I'll mention that the posted 8 a.m. arrival time in Bellingham is on Bellingham's time zone, so that is 7 a.m. ferry time, a little gotcha to look out for when arriving. I want to talk a bit about Wi-Fi, or rather the lack of Wi-Fi. There wasn't Wi-Fi on the Ketchikan. Your phone service relied on service leaking from shore. It was actually pretty good at times. It was fine on all the ports except Haines. I've heard stories where you had to go over to the side of the ship that was docked on to get service, but I never found that. In Canada, service seemed to actually be better than in Alaska. You're going between Vancouver Island and the mainland, mostly, and it seemed there was pretty much always service just because there'd be some town on the edge of the water that had service that was leaking out far enough. Here's me in the absolute middle of nowhere, just near the Canadian border, south of Ketchikan, and there's nothing around here. And I had 2 bars of 5G for no obvious reason, unless there's some secret military base or something there. But there were stretches where I had no service. It was somewhat random. I did have a Garmin InReach mini device just in case I needed to contact someone. It lets you send text messages from anywhere. It's what a lot of hikers use. It does require a decent view of the sky. So I did have a problem on a trip south that when I was in my inside cabin, I couldn't get service for the Garmin just because I was too far inside the ship. So I couldn't have the Garmin track my location overnight. See, it will send a ping every 10 minutes, and then you can see exactly where you went. On the way north, when I had the porthole in my roomette, I could stick the Garmin in the porthole and get service. But in any case, I could go out on deck or go to Solarium, and the Garmin service was fine. I actually tried to stash my Garmin in the Solarium overnight, hidden away in this hanging thing that had motion sickness bags, so I could have it track it all night. But then when I went back in the morning, it was gone. I kind of panicked a bit that someone had stolen it, and I even went online and found a store in Ketchikan that I probably could have made it to that did sell Garmin, so I could buy a replacement and track from Ketchikan south. But then I realized it was much more likely that someone had found it and assumed that I left it by accident, and sure enough, when I went to the purser, someone had turned it in very nicely, but that did end my attempt to have the Garmin track my position overnight. And lo and behold, the Columbia, when it was being refurbished in 2024, they added Wi-Fi using Starlink. It turned out that the tricky part was not Starlink itself. It's that the ship is very thick and solid, lots of steel, and they had to add a lot of Wi-Fi access points on the ship to make it reasonable. It's not available everywhere, it's not in the cabins, but it's in the restaurant, the lounge, or whatnot. So if you need to get serviced, there's a place to get it. So that's good. And I'm hoping when the Ketchikan is refurbished this year, returning to service in 2026, it'll also have Wi-Fi added. It's free as of now to use it. So let's talk a bit about the 2 ships, the Columbia and the Ketchikan. Not that you will have a choice. It will be the Columbia doing this trip in 2025 and the Ketchikan in 2026. And then when they have both, hopefully in 2027, they'll presumably go cross-Gulf in one of them all season, and then the other one will do all of the Bellingham sailings. Still, let's compare the 2 ferries a bit. This is the Ketchikan that we've seen. It's got the solarium at the top there. Then below that, the sun deck, which had those very small cabins, little roomette-style cabins that I was in, which appear to be unique to the Ketchikan. And then the boat deck, which has the lounge and the food and everything. Below that is the cabin deck, which has most of the actual cabins, including my interior cabin on a trip south, part of that little warren on the right. Those are levels 9, 8, 7, 6, and then 4 is the car deck. Meanwhile, this is the Columbia, the ship doing the run in 2025. Similar facilities with some different names. It's got the bridge deck, which is similar to the solarium deck on the Ketchikan, with the solarium and camping areas. Below that is the boat deck, the main social action, observation lounge, dining room, snack bar, etc. Then the main cabin deck, which I'll point out does not have any small roomettes. And then the upper deck, which despite the name is the lowest deck shown here, which has the purser and some more cabins. And then of course the car deck below them. So overall the 2 are pretty similar. Probably the main difference is that the Kennecott has roomettes and the Columbia has a dining room instead of a cafeteria. And maybe the Columbia has a bit more of a classic ocean liner profile. So I think the question then is, how does this compare to one of these babies, a cruise ship like this one I saw in Ketchikan? You might think, well, this is a cheap way to see the inside passage in Alaska towns, a poor person's cruise ship. But in fact, it's not actually cheaper than a cruise ship if you just want to see the scenery in Alaska. If you look at the ferry price list from the summer of 2024 from Bellingham to Skagway, just me was $504 one way. That's for my personal passage, what I would pay even if I didn't have a car or a room. My little two-berth roomette was $179 more and would have been $144 without the window, which is why I don't know if camping on the car deck is really worth the cost savings. Of course, some people want to camp on the car deck, not to save money, but because it's part of the ferry experience and it makes a funny story once it's over. Anyway, that's $650 or $700 one way, but you're getting a pretty cheesy cabin for two people. I mean, cruise ships don't have rooms like that. What they have basically is two-berth cabins, which were $441 without a window and $551 with a window. Let's go with without a window since the cheapest cruise ship cabins are also interior. Still, two people at $504 each, plus $441 for a cabin is almost $1,500, and that's one way. And that's just a sink in your room on the Kennecott, toilet and shower down the hall, while all cruise ships have full baths in every room. That was on a Kennecott last summer. This summer it's the Columbia. The passenger fares are unchanged, still $504 from Bellingham to Skagway, and the four-berth cabins, which have full bathrooms even on the Kennecott, are also still $646 for inside and $866 for outside. For two-berth cabins, the Columbia only has outside cabins with full bath, which are $562, just $11 more than the Kennecott outside two-berthers with just a sink. Anyway, for two people, one way Bellingham to Skagway on the Columbia in 2025 is basically still $500 each for passage and $500 for the cabin, which is $1,500. And then coming back is the same. So $3,000 total for a week round trip from Bellingham to Skagway on the ferry. If you want to take your car, that's extra, a significant amount extra. My car is 15 feet, which is shown as $1,205 one way on this sheet, although they actually only charged me $1,195. I'm not sure why. By the way, by leaving from Haines going south instead of Skagway, I saved $7 on my personal fare, $4 on my car, $14 from the published fare, and $5 on my cabin. Of course, you can't take a car on a cruise ship, so if you want to bring a car with you, the cruise ship is not an option. And in fact, you can't get off a cruise ship in the middle. It's only the full scheduled trip. So if you really need one-way transportation from Washington State to somewhere in Alaska, you need to take the ferry. If you want to do a round trip, though, it makes sense to compare a cruise ship to the ferry. Obviously, on a ferry round trip, you wouldn't bring your car along, so let's forget about the cost of the car. Actually, before I forget about the car, I'll point out that you can drive from Seattle to the Yukon or Alaska if your goal is to get a car and yourself up there. Google Maps shows it is 28 hours, just over 1,500 miles. This is actually the Haines Junction, which is about 3 hours north of Haines, which is where you'd go through on the way to Alaska either way. Also, this takes the Cassiar Highway, which is a bit more remote than the main Alaska Highway route. It went out about an hour, and I would recommend if you were driving in the winter. So you could do it in 3 long days. Even if you include the IRS rate for wear and tear on your car, which is 70 cents a mile, including the cost of gas, so about $1,000, plus 2 nights of hotels, it would be much cheaper than the ferry for one person plus a car, which is almost $2,000 on the Kennecott and a roomette, and more than that on the Columbia. Although, of course, you would spend all day driving instead of doing jigsaw puzzles. And you can also ship your car with a commercial shipping service and fly to Alaska. But anyway, forget the car. Let's compare the $3,000 round trip on the ferry to the cruise ship. I looked at the Anthem of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean ship that is the same design as the Ovation of the Seas that I saw in Skagway. They call it the Quantum class ship. The Ovation of the Seas isn't doing round trips from Seattle. It's doing one-way week-long trips from Vancouver. But the Anthem of the Seas is running round trips from Seattle all summer in 2025. So here we have a trip from Seattle to Juneau, then Skagway, then going up Endicott Arm to Dawes Glacier, which is basically taking a side trip up a fjord off the Inside Passage to look at scenery, then stopping in Victoria, BC, because the cruise ships are not U.S. flagged, so they have to stop in a foreign country at least once per trip. And looky there, the cheapest cabin, an inside cabin, is only about $1,000 a person, so $2,000 for 2 people. For under $3,000 total, about the cost of doing it on the ferry, you get an ocean view, although it's mostly an inside passage view, basically what the Columbia offers. Then, of course, you can pay more for a balcony and a suite and all that. The ferry has no balconies in any rooms, just FYI. But for approximately $3,000, you could book a round trip for 2 people in an ocean view, 2-person cabin with a full bath on either the ferry or the cruise ship. And of course, the cruise ship is more luxurious. They probably make the beds for you. They probably have blankets in their blanket drawer. And it includes all the food you can eat all the time. And there's a ton to do on the cruise ship itself. Plus, the cruise ship is optimized for time in port. You get 9 hours in Juneau and 13 hours in Skagway and 10 hours in Victoria, have high tea at the Empress Hotel, ooh la la. And the cruise ships in Juneau dock right next to the downtown. But even if they docked out of town, they would bus you in. On the ferry, we had 7 hours in Juneau, but it was from 10:30 at night to 5:30 a.m. on the outskirts of town. And the cruise ships have a full menu of excursions in all the stops. I don't think alcohol is free on cruise ships, or you have to pay extra for all you can drink, but of course it's not free on the ferry either, and the bars are probably open longer on the cruise ship. Despite this, I would actually consider taking the ferry again for a trip to Alaska, even if just a week round trip. So what advantages does the ferry have if it costs about the same, besides the opportunity to pay even more to bring your car along? For one thing, the cruise ships don't go everywhere. That trip on the Anthem of the Seas only goes to Juneau and Skagway plus Dawes Glacier. They actually switch it up over the summer with different itineraries, so sometimes it goes to Sitka or it goes to Ketchikan, but that means trading off another port or missing a day at sea with no stops in port, which on a cruise ship is actually quite nice because you can explore all the ship has to offer. The cruise ships can move faster than the ferry, but because they dedicate so much time to being in port, they don't have as much time to stop in so many places. And then there are towns like Petersburg and Wrangell, which the big cruise ships don't go to because they're too hard to get to, there isn't enough to do there, or both. So if you want a trip where you see Ketchikan and Petersburg and Juneau and Haines, or at least the relevant ferry dock real quick, you need to take the ferry. And the fact that the cruise ships are in port during the day means that a lot of the movement when the scenery is going by is overnight. Of course, this is far north in the summer, so there's a lot of daylight, but the ferry still spends a higher percentage of time going past scenic views while it's actually light outside and more time in port in the middle of the night. And the ferry doesn't need to stop in Canada because it is U.S. flagged. There is the flag there, in fact. This also means all the employees have legal U.S. employment status, if you care about that. The ferry actually used to stop in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which it passes right by. Not because it had to, like the cruise ships that have to stop in Canada because they aren't U.S. flagged, but just to provide service. The interruption in service there apparently started as a disagreement over whether U.S. border guards could carry arms in Canada. Then COVID came along and shut down all tourist visits to Canada, and for some reason it has not started up again. I once did an Alaska cruise where the captain made a game day decision to sail north on the outside of Vancouver Island, on the ocean side for speed, since they could sail a little faster out there. I think that is unusual for a cruise ship. They usually take the inside passage between Vancouver Island and the mainland. I certainly saw several cruise ships there when we were in there. But the Alaska Ferry, as far as I know, will always take that passage, which is more scenic and also calmer. Although the cruise ships are so big, and I believe they have better stabilization tech, so I didn't have any real issue with seasickness. I felt more woozy on the 2 hours on the ferry when we were exposed north of Vancouver Island than I did on a cruise ship that was going up the outside of Vancouver Island for an entire day. Now, of course, that's weather dependent, but it was in the same season, summer. Actually, if you want to digress just a bit more, I noticed from my Garmin track that the ferry did stay a bit more on the ocean side on the way north, still inside Vancouver Island in that part. But then north of there, it stayed more out on the ocean than it did on the way south. You can see this is the north end of Vancouver Island there at the bottom. The track more to the left is the way north. We stayed out where there are no islands to the west for a longer time than on the way down. The track more to the right when we were exposed to the minimum amount of time, only the parts where we have to go out in Queen Charlotte Sound. Another thing, of course, is that the Alaska Ferry runs all year. It's actual transportation to Alaska. The only way to get to most of these places besides flying, and you can't bring your car on a plane. It's running every week right now in the middle of winter. And you can get off the ferry if you want to and pick it up later. In some of these towns, if you get off, you have to wait a week and pick up the next ferry. But I did, in fact, meet a few people who were planning to do that, just hang out in each town for a week. They were Australian, as you might expect, and did not have a car. But even with a car, none of these towns except Haines and Skagway are connected to the North American road network. So if you wanted to have a car to knock around for a week in Ketchikan and didn't want to rent it, you could take the ferry. And certainly anyone could get off in Juneau, spend as long as they wanted there, and then take the day boat up to Haines or Skagway, and then drive on from there. And getting back to the ferry versus a cruise ship, the ferry definitely has a sort of homey feeling, we're all in this together kind of thing. It's not a once-in-a-lifetime cruise, so people are mellow. Whether you go with kids depends a bit on how much your kids like jigsaw puzzles and can entertain themselves, but I certainly saw families with kids, and nobody seemed to mind if they were playing hide and seek in the lounge, which I think would be frowned upon on a cruise. I also would recommend the ferry if traveling alone, as I was. I know people who have done big boat cruises alone and said it was fun, but they do seem to be geared towards couples and families. The ferry has a lot of people traveling alone because it's transportation, just like there are a lot of people flying alone. It's perfectly normal to sit down with someone you don't know and do a jigsaw puzzle with them or say, hey, can I join you for a meal? People just sort of expect that, like solo travelers anywhere. I also think there's a bit of an effect where you might be bored, slightly bored, but if you're by yourself, it's fine because you can just choose to look out the window or read a book or take a nap. No pressure to make sure the other person is not bored because there is no other person. And there's also no sense of wasting your precious time. On a cruise, you might be sitting around thinking, this is my only chance to try that specific restaurant, or I haven't played the mini golf course yet, or whatever. Things that you implicitly paid for as part of the cruise fare. So there is that fear of missing out. On a ferry, there isn't that much to do, so you can sit around doing nothing without feeling guilty about it. So it's a different experience from a cruise, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my cruise also, but I enjoyed the ferry a lot more than I expected. And as I said, I really quite look forward to the trip back south, even though it was kind of more of the same. Anyway, that's my video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to book the Alaska Ferry, the Columbia is sailing this summer, doing the same round trip, leaving Bellingham at 6 p.m. every Friday and returning back at 8 a.m. the following Friday. If you want more information, I recommend this Facebook group. It has a lot of people on there who answer questions. Oh, and look, it's AI enabled. I don't actually know what that really means. Can't actually figure out how to ask it a question, which is too bad, or I would have added a picture of it giving a dopey answer. Oh, wait. Turns out I can do it from my phone. Let's see, it suggests I ask about home construction workshop ideas. Don't recall that being a topic of conversation, but maybe I missed a few posts. What do our new AI overlords think about the Columbia versus the Ketchikan? Apparently there was once a great Sunday night halibut buffet on the Columbia. Watch out for that. Anyway, you can also go to ferryalaska.com to get more details and book your trip, or you can call them. Thank you.